From courtesan to royal mistress, Madame Jeanne du Barry was a rare figure who rose from poverty to become the most powerful woman in France. Her beauty was a dangerous gift, bringing trouble from youth to the final breath. She was the last love of King Louis XV and a famous rival of Marie Antoinette. During the French Revolution, she was cruelly betrayed and eventually lost her life to the guillotine. With historical research and AI reconstruction, let's now see the life of Madame du Barry, the last official royal mistress of France. Jeanne Bécu was born on the 19th of August, 1743, in the small town of Vaucouleurs. She was the illegitimate daughter of a seamstress named Anne Bécu. The identity of her father was never confirmed, though he was possibly a local friar. Her grandfather, Fabien Bécu, was allegedly a very handsome man who married a widowed countess. However, after the countess died, Fabien returned to his own class and married Jeanne's grandmother. When Jeanne was 3, her mother's presumed lover, Monsieur Billiard du Monceau, took them into his care and they moved to Paris. There, her mother worked as a cook for du Monceau's mistress, Francesca. Francesca adored pampering little Jeanne. She treated her like a living doll, often dressing her in fine silk. This was where Jeanne had her first taste of luxury. She spent those early years watching how Francesca used wit, beauty, and calculated charm to stay wealthy and influential. With the support of du Monceau, Jeanne entered the Saint-Ours convent to receive a proper education. There, she spent 9 years learning to read and write, as well as music, drawing, and domestic skills. She was an excellent student. By 15, she returned to the mansion as a beautiful young lady. But this likely sparked Francesca's jealousy. At Francesca's demand, du Monceau evicted them from the mansion. She first worked as a street vendor and then as an assistant to a famous hairdresser named Lemetz. They briefly became lovers until his mother found out. Her next role was as a companion to a wealthy widow, Madame de la Garde. She read books and poetry aloud to her, but she was thrown out after the widow's 2 married sons showed too much interest in her. At 18, she became an assistant at a luxury millinery shop called À la Toilette, run by Madame Labille. Even before she met the king, Jeanne's beauty was already legendary in Paris. Some research suggests she had a daughter named Marie Joséphine Bécu around this time, and the father was likely Arnaud de la Porte, who later became the minister of the Marine. By 20, Jeanne met the man who changed everything. Jean-Baptiste du Barry was a nobleman with a truly terrible reputation. She became his mistress, but this was never about love. He was essentially the manager of her career as a courtesan. At 23, Jeanne had become a premier courtesan in the most elite circles of Paris. She was known by the beautiful name Mademoiselle l'Ange. L'Ange means the angel in French. King Louis XV was nearly 60. He was lonely, depressed, and grieving. His legendary mistress, Madame de Pompadour, passed away in 1764, and his only son followed just a year later. Jean-Baptiste saw his opening and successfully convinced the king's valet, Lebel, to help. Jeanne was 24 when they slipped her into the king's private quarters. She was beautiful, she was vibrant, and Louis XV was instantly charmed. Soon after Queen Marie Leschinska passed away in 1768, the king wanted her to be his maîtresse en titre, the official royal mistress. However, there was a problem. According to court protocol, only a married noblewoman could be the king's mistress. So Jean-Baptiste made his own brother marry her. Alongside the wedding, he forged a birth certificate that shaved 3 years off her age and even turned her alleged father's name into a fake noble lineage called de Vaubernier. Jeanne's legal husband took his payoff from the king and walked out of her life. Through this marriage, she finally became Madame du Barry. Next, she needed to be formally introduced at court by a high-ranking noblewoman. But as you can imagine, no one volunteered, until they found Madame de Béarn, who was heavily in gambling debt. The king cleared her debts in exchange for the favour. Madame du Barry's grand début at Versailles happened on the 22nd of April, 1769, when she was 25. In the Hall of Mirrors, every second beat like a ticking clock. She was late. The nobles whispered that she had lost her nerve, or perhaps Countess Béarn had sprained her ankle again. But when Madame du Barry walked in, everyone was stunned. She was wearing a grand habit de cour, the most formal gown of the age, along with jewellery that the king gave her. Her massive gown of silver brocade, encrusted with diamonds and gold embroidery, shimmered with every step. With the queen gone, she was now the most powerful woman in France. The king showered her with endless jewellery and handed her the keys to the Petit Trianon. This was the same estate that would later become Marie Antoinette's famous sanctuary. When du Barry was 26, the king gifted her a 7-year-old Bengali boy named Zamor. She dressed him in silk and silver and provided him with a proper education in reading, writing, and philosophy. This was incredibly rare for a page. Later in our story, he would play a key role in her death. Madame du Barry's arrival at court disgusted the king's daughters. His youngest daughter, Madame Louise, even became a nun because she wanted to wash away her father's sins. The 14-year-old Marie Antoinette arrived in France in 1770 to marry Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI and the grandson of Louis XV. This was only 1 year after Madame du Barry became the royal mistress. Marie Antoinette was encouraged by the king's daughters to despise her. For 2 years, she humiliated du Barry by refusing to speak a single word to her. Because of court etiquette, the mistress could not speak to the Dauphin unless spoken to first. This sent a signal that the future queen was questioning the decisions of the king. Du Barry complained to Louis XV, and eventually this Cold War became an international incident, threatening the alliance between France and Austria. The tension escalated when du Barry was seen laughing at a scandalous joke about Marie Antoinette's mother, Maria Theresa. In private, Marie Antoinette called her la créature, that creature. Yet, a princess's pride was no match for political reality. Marie Antoinette's mother, the Empress of Austria, demanded she surrender. On New Year's Day 1772, Marie Antoinette finally gave in. She walked up to du Barry and said just one sentence: "There are a lot of people at Versailles today." Imagine the weight of those words. A royal mistress had the power to force the future queen to speak against her will. The role of royal official mistress was more than just being the king's lover. It was a powerful position that influenced national politics, diplomacy, and the arts. In fact, most people who wanted to get close to the king knew they had to see her first. She was a key promoter of the neoclassical style over Rococo. Du Barry didn't just renovate the estate Louis XV gifted her at Louveciennes. She had a new pavilion built on the grounds. It was here that she famously rejected a series of Rococo paintings called The Progress of Love and replaced them with works in the emerging neoclassical style. You might recognize this famous masterpiece by the same painter she rejected. She also shaped the look of Sèvres porcelain, bringing an ancient Greek style to their designs. Her influence was just as powerful when it came to her charitable work. A noble couple, the Count and Countess of Luesme, were evicted from their home over their debts. After the Countess shot an officer dead in the chaos, the couple were facing execution. When du Barry learned of this, she fell to her knees before Louis XV and refused to rise until he granted them mercy. The king was deeply moved by her and famously told her, "Madame, I am delighted that the first favour you have asked me is an act of humanity." She also stepped in for a young girl facing the death sentence for concealing a stillbirth. The law in the 18th century cruelly defined this tragedy as infanticide. Du Barry wrote a direct letter to the Chancellor of France and successfully saved the girl. Aside from the king's daughters, many plotted her downfall. Beatrix, the Duchess of Gramont, and her brother, the Duke of Choiseul, spent a fortune on pamphlets mocking du Barry's past. Beatrix was jealous because she wanted to be the royal mistress. To fight back, du Barry allied with the Duke of Aiguillon. They found that Choiseul was secretly pushing France towards war, while the king wanted peace. On Christmas Eve 1770, du Barry revealed this to the king. He eventually exiled Choiseul and his sister from court. Marie Antoinette was shocked by the news. Choiseul was the architect of the alliance between Austria and France, and he was the man who made her marriage happen in the first place. But at court, a major victory doesn't mean you can always trust the people around you. Duke Aiguillon was worried that Louis XV might one day lose interest in her. Barely a year later, he introduced a beautiful Dutch noblewoman named Albertine Elizabeth Pater to the king. She was once the lover of Duke Choiseul. Madame Pater became an unofficial mistress to Louis XV. There were even plans to arrange a secret marriage between the king and this new mistress. But Du Barry was not going to let that happen. After she hinted that the new mistress might be a spy, the king immediately kept his distance. Interestingly, Madame Pater later became a friend of Marie Antoinette. She met her through Diane de Polignac, the sister-in-law of the famous Duchess of Polignac. In 1772, Louis XV ordered Parisian jewelers to create a luxurious diamond necklace worth 2 million livres. To put that in perspective, that amount could buy 10 mansions in the centre of Paris. This was the very necklace that would later destroy the reputation of Marie Antoinette. As we mentioned in our last video, the public blamed the Queen as a reckless spender over a necklace she never even owned. But before the necklace was finished, King Louis XV fell ill. Louis XV felt the first symptoms of smallpox while he was staying at the Petit Trianon. He immediately returned to the palace to rest. Du Barry stayed right by the king's bedside despite the terrifying risk of infection. On the 4th of May 1774, Louis XV asked her to leave Versailles. He had 2 reasons. He wanted to protect her from smallpox, and he also needed to receive his last rites. That meant sending his mistress away so he could confess his sins to God. Madame du Barry was only 30 at the time. She left the palace and went to live at Rouet, which is about 10 kilometers away from Versailles. After she left, Louis XV said, "So she is gone? Good. That is better for her." About 1 week later, Louis XV died at the age of 64. Marie Antoinette immediately had her banished to a convent. At first, the nuns treated her like a sinner, yet her kind and generous nature soon won them over. The abbess even later wrote to Louis XVI to plead for her. Du Barry was eventually allowed to retire to her private estate in Louveciennes when she was 33. In our last video, we mentioned Marie Antoinette's brother visited France to save his sister's marriage. On that same trip, he also visited Du Barry. He found her charming and intelligent, which was nothing like how his sister had described. Du Barry started dating the Duke of Brissac and a British nobleman named Henry Seymour. Later, she broke up with Henry. This man, out of jealousy, famously sent her a painting with the words, "Leave me alone," written in English. Duke Brissac treated Madame du Barry with love and respect. He even put her in his will to make sure she would have his money and jewellery if he passed away. This made his wife furious, and they had a legal fight. However, this battle between the two madames never had a winner because the French Revolution later decided the money belonged to the country. The French Revolution broke out in 1789 when she was 45, but she wasn't immediately targeted. The locals loved her because she had been so charitable for years. She sponsored chapels and provided dowries for poor village girls. When Paris radicals came for her, the villagers actually stood their ground to protect her. Madame du Barry's downfall began when her home was robbed. In 1791, when she was 47, her massive collection of jewellery was stolen. The thieves fled to London, so she had to go there 4 times to recover it. In early 1793, Louis XVI was executed. Suddenly, her past as a royal mistress went from old news to a mark of treason. Plus, she looked very suspicious to the revolutionaries during those trips to London. They accused her of being a spy, smuggling wealth to support their enemy. Then came the ultimate betrayal. Remember Zama? He testified against her. Though he lived in luxury, Zama's education eventually made him realize he was being treated like an exotic pet. Du Barry was arrested in September 1793 when she was 50. In prison, she tried to bargain for her life. She revealed the hiding places of her remaining gems. However, the court did not let her go. On the 8th of December 1793, she was taken to the guillotine. She screamed at the crowd for mercy and kept begging for help. Her last cry was, "One more moment, Mr. Executioner, I beg you." She was buried in the Madeleine Cemetery, the same place as Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. Madame du Barry wasn't the shallow woman from the streets that dramas often portray her to be. She was a tragic soul who fought her way to the top, only to be silenced by the cold blade of the revolution. If you enjoyed this journey through time, please like and subscribe to help me bring more history to life. Thank you for time traveling with me today.